This is the gwolves VUK, gwolves' most experimental and controversial release to date, as this mouse utilizes gwolves' first take on an adjustable sensor system. Now, when the VUK was first announced and before the sensor system was even revealed, another brand who is known for using adjustable sensors on their products made quite a scene about supposed patent infringement, even though the VUK's adjustable sensor system wasn't officially revealed. They went as far as to even loosely threaten legal action against gwolves if their adjustable system interfered with their supposed patents, which funnily enough they never provided any proof of. But as it turns out, gwolves' adjustable sensor system is actually a dual sensor system, which is completely different from the adjustable sensor systems used by other brands. Now, the concept of a dual sensor, while unique in today's market, isn't actually a new concept, as some older mice use dual sensors as well, but on those mice the secondary sensor was used for LOD measurements, not input. But here on the VUK, both of its sensors are fully functional, which gives the VUK the most unique aiming experience I've ever felt on a mouse to date, which is far superior to other brands' adjustable sensors, might I add, and it also gives the mouse that experimental feel given its uniqueness in the current peripheral space. Now, aside from this adjustable sensor system, gwolves has also added several new features here to the VUK, as the mouse uses a brand new high-performance switch, which according to gwolves are the lowest latency switches available on the market. It also uses ultra-low click heights, the lightest I've ever seen on a mouse to date, and a traditional full-size symmetrical shell, which is much larger than their previous releases, but despite its larger size it only weighs 35.5 grams, and there are even more features we'll talk about later. And in typical gwolves style, the VUK delivers exceptional performance, which is further improved by the mouse's dual sensor system, and in today's video we're going to take a deep dive into the VUK to discuss its features, performance, pros and cons, and much more. But before we get into it, if you enjoy the video and want to see more content like this, including a full teardown of the gwolves VUK, leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And a big thank you to all of our channel members who support what I do here on the channel. If you'd like to join them in supporting my efforts and get early access to all upcoming content, consider becoming a channel member today. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I tested the VUK for approximately 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use on both hard and soft pad types, utilizing both the mouse's sensors interchangeably. Over my testing, I also tested all the included skate types, but I used the full-size ones the most out of the stock options, that is until I ran into a unique issue with them, after which I opted to use aftermarket skates. And for firmware, the mouse was tested on version 1.0.40.3, the latest firmware version available at the time of this review. For versions, currently the VUK is only available in 2 colorways, black which has a black shell with black buttons, and white which has a white shell with green buttons. Both of these colorways currently retail for $159 USD, but in the future we'll likely see additional colorways released for the VUK, but said colorways will likely retail for slightly more than the current MSRP depending on the shell's coloring and material. For unboxing and accessories, as is tradition for a gwolves mouse, the VUK includes a boatload of accessories, which gives this mouse, and all of gwolves' other mice for that matter, the best unboxing experience you'll find on the market. But before we unbox the mouse, I do have to quickly talk about the box art, as gwolves is still using AI-generated box art here. Now, I've criticized this art choice every single time I've covered a gwolves product to date, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse here, but I will say I wish gwolves would use actual art or just plain packaging instead of this AI-generated slop. But box art aside, opening the box will find a full set of gwolves' fantastic modular grip tapes, a small accessory package, and a gray carrying case, the same type that's been included with gwolves' other releases. Inside this case we'll find 2 USB A to C cables, both of which are the traditional types, one being a thinner, more flexible cable and the other a thicker, more rigid cable. Also included is a semi-transparent Cyan 8K dongle, which has a lighter weight, weighing around 8.7 grams, but to counteract its lighter weight, the dongle has a very large rubber base, which helps to keep it well anchored in most cases, but it still can be displaced by heavier cables, such as the included shielded one. And lastly, wrapped in a fabric baggie, we have the VUK itself, which comes with 6 dot skates pre-installed on the mouse's base. Circling back to the small accessory package we removed a moment ago, inside we'll find several familiar accessories, the first of which is a small info sheet about the VUK that lists its specs, dimensions, some more miscellaneous information about the mouse, as well as gwolves support information. Next, we have a small skate package which includes several alternative skate types, the first of which is a sheet of 30 PTFE dot skates, the same type of dots that came pre-installed on the mouse's base, but unlike gwolves' other mice who've only include 2 sheets of full-size skates, the VUK includes 4 sheets, 2 larger sheets and 2 smaller sheets, all of which come with a protective film over them, so be sure to remove this film before using them. Now I actually quite like these skates as they're a more traditional size compared to the types included with gwolves' other mice, which allows them to perform quite well, at least on soft pad types. They're not ideal for hard pad types as their PTFE material wears very quickly on harder surfaces, but despite this, over my testing I did mix and match the full-size skates, opting to use the larger surface area pieces from both sets on my mouse, but you can always use the thinner pieces if you want. But while these skates are improved from the previous iterations we've seen on gwolves' other mice, they do have a notable flaw here on the VUK, but we'll talk more about this later. Next, we have the same 2 sheets of skate spacers, the same 1mm and 1.5mm types we've seen included with gwolves' other mice. These are a neat little accessory that has some interesting use cases, and we'll go over the benefits of these little spacers later. Next, we have 2 base cover stickers for the VUK, which you can use to cover the mouse's open base, acting as a barrier preventing debris from getting into the mouse's shell. Now, since the mouse's shell is solid, not open like many of gwolves' other mice, this mouse isn't as susceptible to debris related issues, but I would still recommend using this base cover sticker to prevent any potential issue, and specifically to prevent debris buildup on the battery's exposed adhesive on the mouse's base. And lastly, for the inbox accessory package, we have 2 extra adhesive pads, which are a very useful accessory as you can use these pads as replacement ones for the mouse's battery, or other mice's batteries for that matter. So if you plan on modding the VUK's battery for a larger or smaller one, keep these pads on hand as you can use these to re-anchor the battery easily. Alright, that's everything for the inbox accessories. Now let's talk about the mouse's extra accessory package, which includes a pack of 2 arm sleeves. These sleeves are the same palm design we've seen included with gwolves' other mice, which admittedly is a bit of a confusing decision here on the VUK as it's a full-size mouse and you'll rely on palm contact a lot to use this mouse, whereas this arm sleeve is going to cover the palm contact, negating the usage experience. I was really hoping gwolves would have included some more standard arm sleeves as opposed to the palm style here, but regardless they've kept the palm design. The material of these sleeves is also the exact same as the other arm sleeves gwolves has included with their mice, meaning that while they perform well on hard pad types, they're oddly controlled when used on fabric pads, and as such I'd only use these sleeves short term until you can get a proper gaming optimized sleeve, as aftermarket sleeves will perform better on all pad types and have superior durability. Next, we have 4 packs of gwolves' lightweight clay included here, which is arguably the best accessory included with the VUK, as you can use this clay to alter the mouse's shape, creating finger rests, ledges, or even widening or raising the height of the mouse's shell. This clay is very versatile as you can use it for essentially anything on any mouse, but the instructions for the clay aren't the best. But if you're interested in learning more about this lightweight clay and how to properly utilize it, you can check out my full guide video, which will be linked on screen here and down in the video description. And the last accessory we have here is a small resealable bag, which is designed to be a storage bag for the mouse, aiding in shielding the mouse from debris buildup when it's not being used. Now, given the mouse's solid shell, again the mouse is less prone to debris related issues already, but given its open base I would still recommend storing the mouse in this bag when it's not being used, just as a precaution to avoid any potential debris related issues. And for warranty coverage, the VUK has a 1-year warranty provided by gwolves, and the terms and conditions for said warranty can be found on their website. For performance, the VUK is overall a very impressive mouse, arguably being the most impressive gwolves mouse they've ever released, as the adjustable sensor, or more accurately dual sensor system, is very well implemented, and the forward sensor specifically feels amazing to aim with, but there is definitely an acclimation period on this mouse due to how forwardly the sensors are positioned, as the VUK has the most forwardly positioned sensor I've ever used to date. As such, there is a steep learning curve of sorts here to utilizing the forward sensors, and it will take a week or 2 to get accustomed to it, even longer if you're coming from a mouse with a standard sensor position. But the learning curve is absolutely worth it, as the forward sensor feels amazing to use and gives the VUK the most unique aiming experience I've ever felt on a mouse to date. However, on my VUK there is a very odd bug, where sometimes if the battery is fully discharged or when the mouse is power cycled, occasionally the mouse will default to its central sensor from the top one. As such, you have to manually check what sensor the mouse is using by waving your finger finger under both the sensors to make sure the mouse didn't change it without you knowing. Now this only happened once or twice over my testing period, and I assume this is something that will be fixed with a future firmware update, but in the meantime, if your VUK is using firmware version 1.0.40.3, keep an eye out for this odd bug. Another notable aspect to the VUK's design here is its shape, which is very well implemented, as gwolves has finally made a large mouse, and this along with the hti-s Ultra are the only gwolves mice I can actually use with my natural claw grip, but despite its larger size, the shape is great for all hand sizes and grip styles as well, and we'll talk more about the VUK shaping later. But while the mouse's shape is great, the mouse does lack a coating and has that indented honeycomb shell texturing. As such, and just like all of gwolves' previous releases, you will be 100% reliant on grip aids to grip the mouse. Thankfully though, in typical gwolves style, the mouse includes great grip tapes, or you could use aftermarket grips if needed, but this is to be expected as this is the usage experience for every gwolves mouse I've covered here on the channel. And as I alluded to earlier, I ran into a very unique issue with the VUK stock skates as they actually interfered with the mouse's forward sensor due to adhesive bleeding. Now in fairness to gwolves, their stock skates have always bled adhesive to varying degrees, but it's never been an issue until now. This is because the VUK skates are designed to go around the forward sensor. Because of this, when the skate's adhesive bleeds, it causes debris to build up around the forward sensor to the point where it caused several instances of tracking issues over my testing. So while the VUK stock skates performed well and are an improvement over the ones we've seen included with gwolves' previous mice, I sadly wasn't able to use them for very long due to the adhesive bleeding, and I was forced to use aftermarket ones over the stock options, as using aftermarket skates resolved this issue entirely. But aside from the unique issue with the mouse's stock skates and the odd bug where the sensor would change sometimes, the only other notable downside to the VUK's performance is its wired usage, as the mouse's charging port is located on the mouse's lower right side, not at the top like you traditionally see. Because of this unique position, using the VUK wired is quite awkward, as the cable often unbalances the mouse and it can interfere with horizontal movements, specifically on soft pad types. Now we'll talk more about the mouse's wired usage later, but for now just note that I'd highly recommend against using the VUK wired. But overall, aside from the mouse's quirks, the VUK is a fantastic mouse in terms of actual performance, mainly due to the mouse's dual sensors, but also due in part to the fantastic polling rate implementations and the new switches gwolves is using here as they perform amazingly, and the mouse's main clicks are further improved by the ultra low click heights, which makes the main clicks extremely responsive, almost too responsive in some cases, but the main clicks are a notable highlight here as these new switches are a massive improvement over the switches gwolves have used on their previous releases. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that my VUK was sent to me directly by gwolves, so take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. Now for build quality, the VUK, just like many of gwolves' previous mice, is very well built, and the mouse's shells are quite rigid with no noticeable creaking or flexing during use. But just like the hti-s Ultra and the hti-s2 Pro, the rear shell region can flex if direct pressure is applied to it, however this area won't ever flex during normal use. For QC, the unit is unsurprisingly very well QC'd, as the PCB soldering is great without noticeable issues, and the mouse's buttons are well implemented across the board, specifically the main clicks as I just mentioned, due to their low click heights and their special switches. But as mentioned earlier, the VUK is using the same honeycomb shell texturing we've seen on many of gwolves' previous releases. Thankfully, this is the filled type, but this shell texturing is still quite difficult to grip due to the lack of a shell coating, and the shell texturing can be a little abrasive against skin. As such, the use of grip aids, such as the mouse's included ones or aftermarket ones, is highly advised, as they fix both the shell's gripability and textural issues, and we'll talk more about the VUK's included grips and its compatibility with aftermarket grips in a few minutes. For weight, despite the VUK's larger size, gwolves is advertising that the mouse weighs a mere 35.5 grams, which is a very impressive weight spec considering the mouse's larger size. But oddly enough, gwolves isn't advertising any plus-minus gram ratio on this 35.5 gram spec, but I assume the industry standard of plus-minus 2 grams applies here. Unfortunately though, in reality, in the VUK stock configuration with its pre-installed dot skates, my unit weighs 36.31 grams, and without any skates the mouse weighs 36.12 grams. However, when you add the weight of the mouse's skates, the smaller surface area set adds approximately 1.5 grams, bringing the mouse's stock weight to approximately 37.2 grams, whereas the larger surface area set adds approximately 1.40 grams, increasing the stock weight to approximately 37.52 grams. And in addition to the weight added by the mouse's stock skates, since the shell lacks a coating, you'll need to use grip aids on the VUK shell, such as the included modular ones, which in their full-size configuration, the grips add approximately 3.23 grams, jumping the mouse's stock weight to approximately 39.44 grams, and in their modular form, the grips add approximately 2.78 grams, increasing the mouse's stock weight to approximately 38.9 grams. So, despite the VUK being advertised as weighing 35.5 grams, in reality the mouse will weigh anywhere from 36.3 to 40.7 grams, which is well outside the 35.5 plus minus 2 gram spec that is advertised by gwolves. This is very disappointing to see, as the advertised weight of the HT-s2 Pro was quite accurate, and I was hoping to see the accurate weight spec continue here on the VUK, but sadly gwolves are back to their old ways, as the advertised weight spec for the VUK is not even close to accurate. As such, gwolves should update the VUK's advertised weight to better reflect the mouse's true weight when using the included skates and grip aids. Personally speaking, I think the mouse should be advertised as weighing 38 plus minus 2 grams, as that would better reflect the true weight of the VUK. But despite the inaccurate weight spec, the VUK's true weight is very good considering the mouse's larger size, and in reality the mouse's true weight won't significantly impact the mouse's usage experience, and the mouse feels great to use as I mentioned earlier despite this, but I do wish gwolves would more accurately advertise the mouse's true weight, as advertising that the VUK weighs 35.5 grams is just completely false. For axis balancing, the VUK is centrally balanced as expected, being balanced at the mouse's physical midline roughly at the 62.4mm mark, but unlike gwolves' previous mice, the balancing here on the VUK is a much tighter balancing point instead of the ranges we've seen on their other mice. This is due to the mouse's length, as the VUK is much longer compared to gwolves' other, shorter mice, hence why the balancing here is tighter. For y-axis balancing, given the mouse's symmetrical nature, unsurprisingly the mouse is evenly balanced on its y-axis, but as mentioned earlier, due to the positioning of the mouse's USB-C port, the mouse will be unbalanced by the weight of the cable, making its wired usage less than ideal. But despite the more traditional axis balancing, keep in mind that the mouse's central balancing is disjointed from both the mouse's sensors, more so the top sensor than the central one, but even that sensor is forward of the mouse's balancing point. This disjointed balancing does give the VUK an unbalanced feel initially, and it will take a couple days to get accustomed to the mouse's central balancing, in addition to the acclimation period for the VUK sensors, specifically the top one. Also keep in mind that the VUK's battery is installed in the shell's rear region, acting as a ballast of sorts to the mouse's balancing. As such, if this battery is moved or replaced with a lighter or heavier one, it will skew the mouse's balancing, so keep this in mind if you plan on modding the VUK's battery in the future. For dimensions, as mentioned earlier, the VUK is a much larger mouse compared to many of gwolves' previous releases, which is a good thing in my opinion, as the mouse's longer shape is perfect for my hand size. Now in terms of specific dimensions, the mouse measures 124.8mm long. For widths, at the shell's forward region, at its top the shell measures approximately 60.8mm wide, while at its base it measures approximately 54.5mm wide. At the shell's mid region, at the top it measures approximately 60.3mm wide, and at its base it measures approximately 55mm wide, but it's worth noting that between the shell's forward to mid region, the side shells have a very heavy hourglass-like indentation in them, which measures at its base approximately 53.7mm wide, being the thinnest point of the VUK's overall shell. And lastly, at the shell's rear region, at its base, its widest point, the shell measures approximately 64.6mm wide. And for heights, at the shell's forward region, due to the ultra-low click heights, the front shell measures a mere 2.5mm tall. At its mid region, the shell measures approximately 38.1mm tall, and from the peak of the shell's hump, the shell tapers downward, terminating at the base here, which measures approximately 5.8mm tall. For shaping, and as mentioned earlier in this video, the VUK is a traditionally shaped symmetrical mouse, but it is the largest mouse gwolves has ever released to date. Now the mouse's shell is right-hand optimized, but given its symmetrical nature, the shell can be used with left-handed grip styles, however left-handed users won't be able to utilize the VUK's side buttons. Now in the hand, the VUK shaping is most reminiscent of a slimmed-down Razer Viper V3 Pro, but the VUK's forward and mid regions are shorter, specifically the forward region, as the main clicks are significantly lower profile here compared to the Viper. The two mice's side shell hourglass-like indentations also share similar depths, but the indentations here on the VUK are positioned higher in the side shell's profile, whereas the indentations on the Viper are more centrally positioned. Now for specific shell profiles, looking at the mouse from the top, we can best see the elongated symmetrical shaping of the VUK, with the wider top region, slightly thinner mid region, and wider rounded rear region. Looking from the base, we can better see the mouse's aforementioned symmetrical shaping, but from the base we can much clearer see the shell's curvature, which is much more hourglass-like than it appeared from the top, and we can also see that the base shell is much smaller than the top shell, hence the differing widths we just talked about. Looking from the sides, we can best see the VUK's top shell profile, which is, again, similar to the Viper V3 Pro at least at its rear, but towards the mid to top regions of the shell, the curvature is much more aggressive here on the VUK, specifically towards the front region, as the main clicks are the lowest I've ever seen on a mouse to date. It's also worth mentioning that the top shell's profile peaks towards the mouse's rear shell due to the aggressive curvature, terminating a few millimeters behind the mouse's physical midline. Looking at the mouse from the front, we can best see the main click design, which are an elongated type that protrude from the front shell quite significantly, allowing for the aforementioned ultra-low click heights. From the front we can also see the top shell's curvature, which has a wider rounded shaping to it. From the front we can also see the mouse's side profiles, which are quite outwardly tilted, allowing the thinner base shell to meld to the top shell, and at their forward region, the side shells are slightly rounded, then gradually flatten out towards the mid region, deepening at the aforementioned hourglass-like indentation. Then the side shell evens out again, then inverts its curvature towards the rear region as the side shell profiles meld into the rounded rear region. And lastly, looking from the rear, we can best see the shaping of the rear region, which has the same wider, rounded design as the rest of the shell, the expected shaping we'd find in many symmetrical mice, however it is a little wider towards the rear region here on the VUK. For contact areas for my 25.4 by 10.16 centimeter hands using an angled claw grip here on the VUK, starting with thenar contact, the wider rear hump shaping makes direct contact with my thenar's mid to high region, as well as in my mid palm's mid to high region and on my hypothenar's mid to low region. Now given the VUK's size and shell profiles, the primary anchoring point for my grip style is my mid palm region, while my thenar and hypothenar regions form supporting contacts. Now for finger contact, starting with my thumb, in its natural position it rests towards the top region of the VUK's left side shell, but if needed I can angle my thumb inward, resting it at the deepest point of the hourglass indentation, right below the forward side button. For my index and middle fingers, they rest towards the end region of the main clicks, right around the front of the scroll wheel, and due to the grooves in the main clicks, my fingers are guided towards the middle of the buttons. For my ring finger, it rests roughly opposite of the natural position of my thumb on the shell's opposite side, towards the top region of the hourglass-like indentation on the mouse's right side. And lastly, my pinky rests below my ring finger, slightly below the deepest part of the side shell's hourglass-like indentation. For hand size and grip style compatibility here for the VUK, given the mouse's symmetrical shaping, the mouse is fairly universal, however the length of the mouse might negatively impact some hand sizes and some grip styles. But as a reminder, the VUK symmetrical shaping is right hand optimized, but it can be used ambidextrously, however left-handed users won't be able to utilize the side buttons. Now for hands measuring approximately 15.2 to 16.5 centimeters by 8 to 9.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips. For hands measuring approximately 16.5 to 17.8 centimeters by 9.5 to 10.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 17.8 to 19.1 by 10.5 to 11.5 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 19.1 to 20.3 by 11.5 to 12.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm, claw, and fingertip grips. And lastly, for hands measuring approximately 20.3 to 21.6 by 12.5 to 13.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. But keep in mind this is a rough estimate and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility will vary from person to person. So if you're considering the gwolves VUK, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your fingers to just below your wrist line and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your knuckles excluding your thumb. You can take these measurements and estimate if your hand size and your grip style will be compatible here with the VUK's shaping. Now, as mentioned earlier in this video, the VUK includes a sheet of gwolves' fantastic grip tapes, which come in a modular form and include a hump cover, some extra universal pieces, but oddly, the VUK sheet doesn't include any side button covers, which is a very odd exclusion here, given that every gwolves mouse has previously included them. Now, I assume this is an error, and future batches of the VUK will include the side button covers, but keep this in mind as the current batch doesn't include any. Now, just like the grips we've seen included with gwolves' previous mice, these grips share the same raised hexagonal texturing, sticky material, and thicker form factor, which gives these grips exceptional performance with both wet and dry hands as expected for gwolves stock grips. And as an added benefit, the grip's thicker form factor makes them extremely durable and also allows the grips to be very reusable as they won't warp or tear like thinner grips will, allowing you to adjust their positioning or move them from mouse to mouse without damaging them. And since these grips are modular, unlike traditional full-size grips, you can only install the modular pieces you need, resulting in less weight being added to the mouse overall compared to traditional full-size grips as we talked about earlier. And over my testing, as expected, these grips performed exceptionally well and made the VUK shell much easier to grip compared to its raw uncoated shell. The only issue quote-unquote I have with these stock grips, aside from the lack of side button covers, is that their thicker design causes them to have a noticeable edge to them, and they do widen the mouse's width a little bit. But these are very minimal nitpicks, and overall these included grips are arguably the best stock grips you'll find on the market. But if you dislike the stock grips' thicker design of their surface texturing, you can always use aftermarket grips. But if you plan on using aftermarket grips on any of gwolves' mice that have this honeycomb shell texturing, keep in mind that thinner grips will be less effective at hiding the shell's texturing. This is why the stock grips are so thick, as they're designed to hide the honeycomb texture, so keep this in mind if you plan on using aftermarket grip aids here on the VUK or any of gwolves' other mice, and make sure to get thicker ones for the best experience. For main clicks, as mentioned earlier, the VUK uses a brand new switch type that offers superior performance over the switches gwolves has used on their previous models, and the VUK also has the lowest click heights I've ever seen on a mouse, even lower than the htx-mini's main clicks. But before we talk about these new switches, let's talk about the buttons themselves first. The main clicks, as mentioned earlier, are a wider, longer button design than we've seen on any mouse to date that have a fairly pronounced curvature to them, which matches the top shell's curvature. These buttons are also slightly angled, being the tallest towards the middle of the shell and shorter towards the outer edges, giving the main clicks a slanted look to them. But to counteract this, the buttons do have a subtle but wide grooving in their surface, which runs throughout the entire button, which not only helps to guide your fingers towards the center of the buttons, it also helps to somewhat flatten the surface of the buttons, helping to somewhat counteract their slanted shaping. These buttons also share the same filled honeycomb texturing we've seen on gwolves' previous mice, which is an interesting decision as gwolves has used split texturing on many of their more recent releases. But regardless, keep this texturing in mind as it can be a little abrasive when gripped raw, and keep in mind that the buttons, like the rest of the mouse's shell, lack any coating, which further hampers their gripability. As such, and just like I say when I review any gwolves mouse, I'd highly recommend using grip aids here, either the included ones or aftermarket ones, as grip aids not only make the shell buttons much easier to grip, it also covers their honeycomb texturing, making the textural experience of the main clicks much better. Another great attention to detail here on the main clicks is that the buttons are indented into the mouse's shell, albeit slightly, but enough to keep the main clicks free of any interference issues caused by fingers resting against the mouse's side shell. For click heights, as I mentioned several times in this video already, the VUK utilizes extremely low click heights on their buttons, the lowest I've ever seen to date, as at their end region the buttons are a mere 2.5mm high. From there, the main clicks height increase to around 24.1mm at their mid region and continue to increase their height to around 33mm tall at their top region. Now in terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the VUK's main clicks. Now for the VUK's main click switches, gwolves is advertising that the mouse is using gwolves custom switches, but in reality the mouse is using Wano's brand new SPDT switches, which have been binned by gwolves and have a cycle rating of around 80 million cycles. Now many of you probably haven't heard of these new switches as of yet, as they are a brand new SKU from Wano, but these are your typical switch, as these switches feature the same adjustable actuation system that was used on the KLGX switches found on the OP1 and XM2 series mice from Endgame Gear. This dual actuation feature, or as Wano terms it, the SR latch system, allows the switches to function in two modes, as in their standard mode, the switches act like a traditional switch, where an actuation occurs when the hammer makes contact with a traditional contact at the base of the switch, but in their SR mode, instead of actuating when the lower contact is activated, the moment the hammer disconnects from an additional contact point at the top of the switch inputs an actuation without the need for the hammer to travel to the base contact. This dual actuation system results in these SPDT switches having significantly lower latency, as there is less physical travel than traditional switches, again the same concept as what we saw in the KLGX switches. Now gwolves is claiming that these switches are supposedly the #1 switch for click latency, but they don't provide any data for this, nor do we know how these switches stack up against the KLGX switches yet due to their newness, but regardless, compared to a traditional switch type, these new SPDT switches are a significant improvement, especially when combined with the VUK's low click heights. Another great aspect to these new switches is that despite their new tech, these switches maintain a similar click feel to the Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot switches, which one could argue are the most popular mouse switch on the market as of late, and they're rated for an actuation weight of approximately 55 grams, while the Blue Shell versions are rated for approximately 60 grams. This similar actuation weight allows these SPDT switches to maintain the great but overused Wano click feel, while significantly improving their performance, which is a great thing to see and a fantastic upgrade. And compared to the HTS Ultra, which used Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot switches for its main clicks, the VUK's SPDT switches feel essentially identical, but as expected, depending on where you physically actuate the shell buttons, the actuation weight of the main clicks will change slightly, as at the click's end to mid region they are the expected 55 gram range, while at the top region the buttons are heavier, having an actuation weight of around 65 grams. Another noteworthy aspect of the main clicks here is that the shell button stabilizers, instead of being positioned inside the shell like we commonly see on almost every mouse on the market, they're actually positioned to outside the shell, hooking into the very front of the shell. This, while being very unique, allows the main clicks to have fantastic stabilization with a very low degree of play to both the buttons even when actuated. In terms of travel, both the main clicks have a low to medium degree of pre-travel and a low degree of post-travel, but to counteract the higher pre-travel, both switches do have a very snappy rebound that keeps both the main buttons very responsive and quite spammable. But it's worth noting that the switch's travel ranges don't matter as much as they would on a traditional switch, as in their SR mode, the low to medium degree of pre-travel is the only thing you really need to be concerned with, and with the SR mode enabled on the switches, I found both the main clicks to be very sensitive, almost to a fault, as I found myself unintentionally clicking quite frequently, especially when clicking at the button's end regions. So despite the longer quote-unquote travel ranges on the clicks here, the SR mode on these switches negates this entirely and makes the main clicks very responsive. Now as a final note here, I often critique Wano switches, specifically the Blue Shell Pink Dot versions, for being generic. As while they perform well and have a decent click feel, they're used on almost every mouse on the market, which definitely hampers their overall feel in my opinion. And I always found that they didn't offer much compared to other switch types, but now that we have a Wano switch with a similar click feel to the Blue Shell variants with an adjustable actuation system, these switches have jumped to the top of my preferred switch list despite their latency not yet being proven, surpassing the KLGX switches solely because those switches are only found on Endgame Gear's mice, whereas Wano switches are found on almost every mouse on the market. And I assume in the future we'll see more and more brands adopt these SPDT switches, which is a great thing as this adjustable actuation switch tech is a genuine game changer, but has been exclusive to KLGX switches until now. And in terms of debounce timing, you can adjust the debounce timing on the main clicks as you can on all of gwolves' previous releases, but keep in mind that setting these debounce values too low and using the SR mode on these switches can cause a lot of misactuations or double clicking, so keep this in mind if you're going to adjust the debounce value on the main clicks here. And if you do find this SR mode on these switches to be too sensitive, you can disable this feature per click in the software. So if you have issues with misactuating the right click during use and you find it to be too sensitive but want the left click switch to have the SR mode enabled, you can configure that in the web-based driver, and we'll talk more about that later. For side buttons, the VUK is using a familiar button design, being these larger, rounded, pill-shaped buttons which are angled slightly forward to match the curvature of the top shell. These buttons are very similar to the buttons we saw used on the HTS2 Pro and htx-mini. They've just been scaled up slightly to better suit the VUK's larger, longer shell. Now these side buttons are centrally positioned, being roughly aligned with the mouse's central balancing point, centered on the 62.4mm mark. Now this is an odd positioning as gwolves often makes their side buttons rather forwardly positioned, but here on the VUK they opted to keep them centered. Now this isn't a bad thing per se, but it does make the buttons tricky to actuate if you have larger hands, as you have to angle your thumb quite inward to actuate the forward button, and even more so to actuate the rear one. Now this won't be an issue on more normal sized hands, but for larger handed folk like myself, keep this in mind as the side buttons can be a little awkward to utilize. But on the plus side, the side buttons are quite pronounced from the mouse's side shell, but just like the main clicks and the rest of the mouse's shell, the buttons do lack a coating, meaning that despite their larger surface area and pronounced nature, the side buttons can be rather difficult to grip. Now normally you can resolve this issue by using the included side button covers, but as we talked about earlier, the VUK doesn't include any, which is very odd as every other gwolves mouse has included some form of side button cover. As such, the usage of the side buttons without a grip aid is less than ideal here on the VUK, which is quite disappointing. Thankfully though, you can resolve these issues by using aftermarket grips or making your own side button covers by cutting little strips out of the extra circular grips. In my case, I was able to use an extra set of side button covers from the HTS2 Pro here on the VUK, and when installed, these side button covers drastically improved the side button's usage, as the grips made the buttons much grippier, and they also further increased the button's height due to their thickness, making the side buttons even more pronounced and a little easier to actuate, but their positioning was still a bit of an issue area for me. Another odd aspect of the VUK side buttons is their gapping. As while there is a gap between the side buttons, it's rather thin despite the larger, longer shell. As such, if you have larger fingers like I do and click the side buttons on their inner edges, it's quite easy to misactuate the opposite button, which is a very frustrating issue to see here, as gwolves' previous mice have also had the same issue, but those mice are always smaller, so the gap between the side buttons couldn't really be widened, but here on the VUK, due to the larger shell, gwolves could have absolutely widened the gapping on the side buttons, which would have prevented this issue. As such, on a future version of the VUK, I would like to see gwolves widen the gapping here on the side buttons, and I'd also like to see the buttons positioned a little more forward in the shell, as doing so would make the side buttons much easier to utilize with larger hand sizes. But to be fair to gwolves, I am nitpicking quite a bit here, and for most people the side button implementation here is going to be completely fine, but in my opinion there's a lot of room for improvement here when it comes to the VUK side buttons, and hopefully on a future iteration of this mouse we'll see them improved. Now in terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the VUK side buttons. For the side button switches, the VUK is using a very familiar switch type, as inside we'll find two TTC brown shell blue dot micro switches, the same switches we saw used for the HTS2 Pro's side buttons. These switches are rated for a 3 million cycle rating and have an estimated actuation weight of around 70 to 75 grams, which does make the side buttons noticeably heavier than the main clicks, but not to a degree that negatively impacts the mouse's performance per se. It just makes the VUK feel a little unbalanced in terms of its click feel. Now I said the same thing about the HTS2 Pro's side buttons, and I think gwolves would benefit from lightening the switches slightly so the mouse's clicks feel a little more balanced overall. For stabilization, both the side buttons are decently stabilized with a slight degree of play to them, slightly more so when actuated, which does give the buttons a slight wobble to them, but said wobble is minimal and didn't impact the side buttons feel. For travel, both the buttons share the same low degree of pre-travel and low to medium degree of post-travel, falling into the low range with lighter actuations and the medium range with heavier ones. But despite the longer travel ranges, both buttons have a snappy rebound to them, which allows the buttons to be quite responsive and spammable despite their longer pre-travel and heavier actuation weight. For scroll wheel, the VUK uses a traditional styled scroll wheel, the same type we've seen used on all of gwolves' more recent releases. Now the wheel itself is a plastic wheel with a rubber ring wrapped around it, which has a flattened linear dotted texturing, which is quite grippable and makes utilizing the scroll wheel very easy. But the wheel here on the VUK is quite shallowly positioned in the mouse's shell, which is disappointing as its shallower design impacts the scroll wheel's range, as you can only scroll 7 steps instead of the usual 10. It's also very easy to accidentally actuate the main clicks if you put too much pressure at the top or bottom of the wheel when scrolling, especially with the switches in their SR mode, which is another thing to keep in mind. Now the recessed nature of the scroll wheel won't affect the mouse's use case too much, but I do wish the wheel was a little more pronounced, as a taller wheel would have a longer scroll range and no potential misactuation issues. On the inside, the VUK uses a TTC Gold dustproof 24-step encoder, the same encoder type we've seen used in many of gwolves' previous releases. As such, the scroll wheel has the same medium strength scroll with semi-pronounced scroll points, which while not being the strongest, are pronounced enough to keep the wheel controllable, so much so I didn't have any issues with over-scrolling or accidentally inputting scrolls when scroll wheel clicking. And for wheel click, the mouse is using another familiar component here, as inside we'll find a taller TDC pillar switch, the same type that we saw used inside the HTS Ultra. This version just has a cyan plunger. Now as expected for a pillar switch, the feeling of the click is spongy at best, with a heavier actuation weight of around 85 grams, and while the switch has essentially no pre-travel, it has a lot of post-travel, around the medium range I'd say, which when paired with the switch's weaker rebound, gives the switch that aforementioned spongy feel, but this is to be expected as every mouse that uses a pillar switch for its wheel click feels like this, so this isn't an issue per se, but if you utilize a scroll wheel click a lot and care about a snappier, more tactile feel, keep in mind that the VUK scroll wheel click is a little on the spongy side. And as a final note for the scroll wheel, just like all of gwolves' other mice, you can adjust the debounce value of the scroll wheel in the web-based driver. Now I've never felt the need to mess with the debounce timing for the scroll wheels on any of gwolves' mice, but if you need to adjust this if you're going to use the scroll wheel for jumping or b-hopping or whatever your use case is going to be, you can freely adjust the debounce values via the web-based driver. For sensors, the VUK, unlike every other gaming mouse on the market, utilizes 2 sensors, both of which are 3950s, specifically the PA 3950 DM-T5QU SKUs. These sensors, as mentioned at the top of this video, are positioned quite uniquely, as one is positioned slightly forward of the mouse's 62.4mm physical midline, resting at around the 75mm mark, whereas the other sensor is positioned at the very top of the mouse's frame, where traditionally a USB-C port would be located, positioned at roughly the 115mm mark. Now the central sensor is the more normal one, akin to the positioning of many other gwolves' mice's sensors, where the forward sensor is incredibly unique and actually feels incredible to aim with, more so than any other forwardly positioned sensor I've used to date. But as mentioned earlier, there will be an acclimation period to get accustomed to both of the sensors' position, more so the top one, as well as the mouse's balancing, as it's centrally balanced, disjointed from both of the sensors. Now in terms of sensor specs, both of the sensors are the expected 3950 implementations, featuring DPI ranges of 50 to 30,000, which is adjustable via 50 DPI steps, IPS ratings of 750 3950 and an acceleration rating of 70 grams. Both sensors also support the expected 0.7, 1, and 2 mm LOD levels, as well as motion sync and angle snapping, but oddly ripple is disabled on both of these sensors. And since these are 3950 series sensors, both sensors also support on-device sensor tilting, allowing you to freely adjust the sensor's angle by 33 degrees both positively and negatively. And for MCU, just like every other gwolves mouse, the VUK uses a Nordic NRF 52840 MCU. As expected, this MCU is very well implemented, however I would have loved to see gwolves update the MCU here on the VUK to the new NRF 54H20, as those SoCs are significantly more power efficient, and we've seen Razer and several other brands adopt these new MCUs with great success. But while it is disappointing not to see new MCUs here, the current implementation is fine by all means, and hopefully on future iterations of the VUK we see the new updated SoCs used. For connectivity, the VUK supports two connectivity types, wired and wireless. However, as mentioned earlier, given the location of the mouse's USB-C port, using the VUK wired is less than ideal as due to the mouse's weight, it gets unbalanced by cables quite easily, and the cable itself will interfere with horizontal movements. As such, while the mouse supports wired connectivity, I'd highly recommend against using the mouse wired as its usage is pretty poor, even when running the wire along your arm due to the balancing issues. And while I've been saying I wanted support for dual 8K Hz on gwolves mice for a long time now, the VUK is the only mouse in their lineup where not having dual 8K makes sense given the USB-C port's positioning. Now on the wireless connectivity, the VUK supports 125 Hz to 8000 Hz, whereas on the wired connectivity, the mouse supports 125 Hz to 1000 Hz. Now to be fair, I'm totally fine with the poor wired experience here on the VUK, as the trade-off is you get the ultra-low click heights, which are well worth it in my opinion. I'll admit I feel weird saying this as I've advocated for dual 8K and improved wired performance on every mouse I've covered here on this channel, but the VUK is going to be my one and only exception to this. But despite the less than ideal wired use case here, the mouse's wireless and wired polling rates as expected for a gwolves mouse are perfectly implemented, and all the rates performed well, and I didn't notice any stability or other noteworthy issues with any of the mouse's polling rates or connectivity types over my testing. For battery, the VUK uses a 250 mAh battery, the expected size for a larger gwolves mouse, which uses a 2mm JST-PH 3-pin connector. However, just like the HT-s2 Pro, gwolves isn't advertising any estimated runtimes for the VUK, which is very odd as they've at least given a 1K Hz estimate on their previous releases. But while gwolves isn't providing any estimates, on the plus side, the battery report issues appear to be fixed here, which is great to see, meaning I can actually give you runtime estimates for the VUK, something I haven't been able to do for the past several gwolves releases. So with my VUK running firmware version 1.0.40.3 set to its max DPI of 30,000, auto sleep set to 600 seconds, the base LED set to solid color, the switches set to their SR latch mode and placed on a jiggler to simulate use. On 1K Hz the mouse's runtime was approximately 65 hours, on 2K Hz the runtime drops to approximately 39 hours, on 4K Hz the runtime drops again to around 29 hours, and lastly on 8K Hz, the mouse's runtime was a mere 16 hours. But keep in mind, turning the SR mode off on the switches or disabling the base LED will slightly extend the mouse's runtime, whereas utilizing the mouse's comp mode will significantly decrease the mouse's runtime. Now admittedly, these runtime values are on the lower end compared to other brands' mice that use similar specs. However, compared to the HTS Ultra which use similar specs, the VUK's runtimes are similar, and thusly fall into the expected range for a gwolves product, though there is definitely room for improvement here, as other brands are able to deliver longer runtimes using similar hardware, but for most use cases, the VUK's runtimes will be more than enough. And for charging, the VUK uses its aforementioned rearly positioned USB-C port for charging. Thankfully, despite its unique positioning, gwolves has made the area around the port wide enough where the mouse is usable with all cable types, which is a great attention to detail. However, as mentioned earlier, the positioning of this port does make the VUK's wired usage quite poor, as the weight of the cable will likely unbalance the mouse, and the cable will interfere with horizontal movements, hence why again I recommend against using the VUK wired or while it's charging. For software, as expected for a gwolves mouse, the VUK uses the same WebDriver used by all of gwolves' previous releases, which is a great thing to see as their WebDriver is quite well implemented and has been improved since we last talked about it. But keep in mind that just like all other WebDrivers, this driver can only be accessed on Chromium-based browsers such as Edge or Chrome, so be sure to use the driver with a compatible browser, and I'll have all the URLs for the WebDriver, as there are several, down in the video description for you all. Now, loading onto the driver's homepage, you'll be prompted to connect the mouse, and once you connect it, you can select from a little drop-down menu, and once you authorize the device, the WebDriver's interface will load in. Now, as expected, the driver is a single page layout with different subsections to control the mouse's various features, and at the very bottom of the page there is a language selector and a night or dark mode toggle, and we're going to start off by talking about the central area of this WebDriver first. Here we have buttons for refreshing and disconnecting the mouse's connection to the driver, a reset button that will factory reset the VUK to its factory settings, a button for the mouse's firmware which is updated manually, as well as a view button which lists the main and scroll wheel's debounce values and the mouse's X and Y axis DPI levels. Under these we have new sensor select buttons which are oddly labeled 1 and 2, which makes initially figuring out what number correlates to what sensor kinda tricky, so to save you some time, the sensor labeled number 2 is the central sensor and the sensor labeled number 1 is the top sensor. I'm quite surprised gwolves didn't just name these buttons middle or top or something similar to better translate what sensor the button controlled. This was probably an oversight and this will likely be updated in the near future. Next to the sensor buttons we also have a slider for the mouse's comp mode which you can enable if desired. Personally speaking, I don't utilize this feature as you get better performance out of the mouse's high polling rates, but regardless this feature is here if needed. Below this slider we have a DPI settings section where you can adjust the number of onboard profiles from 1 to 4, adjust the DPI levels from each level from 50 to 30,000, which is again adjustable via 50 DPI steps, and if desired you can also toggle this axis sync here to allow for different DPI levels on the sensor's X and Y axis. Also in this section you can also adjust the mouse's LED settings, adjusting its mode color, or you can disable it entirely. But keep in mind that when you change the mouse's sensor, its profile will also switch. So if you configure your settings on sensor 1, make sure you configure the same settings on sensor 2, as if you don't manually configure them for both sensors, they will just default to their default profiles. Now moving over to the left side of the driver, we have the key settings section in which we can adjust the rebind options for the mouse's buttons. Sadly though, these options are still quite limited and there is still no option to bind a mouse button to swapping profiles, but there is a new bindable function that will swap the mouse's sensor, which is a nice attention to detail, but again keep in mind this will again change your profile technically speaking. Next, jumping over to the right side of the driver here, we have the parameters setting tab in which you can adjust the debounce levels for both the main clicks and scroll wheel, either manually or via preset levels. Here you can also set the mouse's polling rate, select the desired LOD level, enable or disable motion sync and angle snapping, set the mouse's auto sleep timer, adjust the sensor's angle, and set the main click's SPDT state, which will be enabled by default and will use the upper contact for actuations, and when it's disabled it will use the lower contact, operating like a traditional switch. And towards the bottom of this tab there is a battery readout, which is a little more accurate than it has been on gwolves' previous mice, but I'd still take these values with a grain of salt. And there is also a new setting called key press miss operation protection, which is by default set to 20 milliseconds. Now I assume this is a debounce filter of sorts for the main clicks to filter out sequential actuations, which is a good thing given the extremely responsive nature of the main clicks, but be careful with this feature as if it's set too low it will cause double clicking, just like reducing the debounce value for the main clicks would as well. Now if your driver doesn't show all these options here, click the little DIY slider next to the main clicks and the scroll wheel, and also this arrow at the top right here to fully expand this menu and reveal all of its settings. For repairability, initially I was a little concerned about this aspect of the VUK, as some of gwolves' mice, while being serviceable, are a little difficult to disassemble, but to my surprise the VUK has a pretty traditional disassembly process similar to that of the HTS Ultra, which makes cleaning, modding, or repairing the VUK's internals very easy, which is great to see. And as I mentioned in the unboxing segment of this video, gwolves has included 2 extra adhesive pads for the mouse's battery, so modding or replacing said battery is very easy, But again, keep in mind that the battery is what balances the mouse, and if you install a battery that weighs more or less, it will affect the mouse's balancing, so keep that in mind. But overall, the VUK is a very serviceable mouse, which is great to see, and if you want to learn how to service this mouse yourself, see how it's designed on the inside, or learn more about its modding options, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the VUK's teardown video. For skates, as mentioned earlier in this video, the VUK includes several types of skates as expected for a gwolves mouse, which is great to see, but the skates included here with the VUK are special, as these are the most normal skates we've ever seen included with a gwolves mouse. Now in the mouse's stock configuration, the VUK comes with 6 PTFE dots installed on its base, as well as an additional sheet of 30 PTFE dots of the same type, and 4 sheets of larger surface area PTFE skates. Now the sizing of the larger skates is a little odd, and as such I opted to use a mix of them over my testing, using the larger pieces from both sets forming a large set quote unquote, but you can also use the smaller pieces to form a small set or mix and match as desired. Now all of these included skates are 100% PTFE, the expected type for a gwolves product, and while gwolves skates have historically been fine, these larger skates actually performed really well and they're very fast even in their large configuration, having a similar speed to an X-ray pad Jade skate, which I wasn't expecting, but despite their unusual speed, these skates were great for soft pad use, but due to their 100% PTFE nature, their usage on hard pads is quite underwhelming as they have extremely poor durability, so if you plan on using the VUK on a glass pad, I'd highly recommend using hard pad optimized skates. On the topic of aftermarket skates, the VUK, unlike many of gwolves' previous mice, has fantastic aftermarket skate compatibility, as the mouse's base is completely flat in traditional gwolves style, but has large enough surface area for 6.5 to 8mm dot skates, as well as 8mm to 9.5mm donut skates. You can even install smaller surface area skates on these little supports toward the mid region of the shell if needed. So if you're planning on using the VUK on a hard pad and want to use hard pad optimized skates, you can do so very easily here on the VUK, and I opted to use the X-ray pad Obsidian Donuts as I was using the VUK on both hard and soft pad types over my testing. However, while there have been some improvements to the VUK stock skates here, as mentioned earlier, there is a unique fault to them as the skates actually interfered with the VUK's forward sensor due to the skates bleeding their adhesive. Now this adhesive bleed has always been a trait of gwolves stock skates, and it's never been an issue until now, as since the skates are so close to the top sensor, as debris builds on this bled adhesive from your mousepad in your environment, the debris can actually cause tracking issues with the forward sensor, which I did experience when using the larger surface area skates over my testing. This is why I opted to use the Obsidian Air Donuts over the remainder of my testing, as these skates didn't bleed their adhesive, and I was able to position them right next to the forward sensor without any interference issues. Because of this unique issue, on future batches of the VUK, gwolves absolutely needs to improve their stock skates, specifically their adhesive, to prevent the mouse's stock skates from having these debris related issues, specifically with the top sensor. And lastly, as mentioned earlier, the VUK also includes 2 sheets of foam pads, both of which include 30 pads, but they differ in heights, as one set is 1mm tall and the other is 1.5mm tall. These pads are similar in concept to the layers of SMPF foam we find on X-ray pads Air series skates, as they're designed to sit under the mouse's dot skates and act as a buffering layer of sorts. But since the material of these gwolves spacer is harder, it's not as effective at reducing audio and physical feedback from these skates. What it does better is raise the height of the skates, as their harder material doesn't compress as much as softer SMPF material layers do. Now gwolves says these are included to accommodate higher LOD levels, which makes sense considering their stock skates are so small, but in my opinion they are more effective at raising the skates' height so they are taller, helping to avoid bottoming out issues when using them on softer pads. Now while these are a cool accessory to include, they can only be used with the stock dot skates, which definitely does hamper their overall usage, and in my opinion I'd just rather use aftermarket skates that are taller, but if you want to utilize these pads you can do so with the mouse's stock dot skates. And lastly, for cables, as expected for a gwolves product, the VUK includes two types of stock cables. The first type is a thinner USB A to C cable, which is a thinner, more flexible design with a smooth paracord wrapping, but this cable lacks a tilted USB-C end. The other cable is a thicker USB A to C cable as well, but this cable is a much thicker, shielded type that has a rougher paracord wrapping, and due to its increased thickness, this cable is quite rigid, and this cable also lacks a tilted USB-C end. Now, I've critiqued these cables every time I've covered a gwolves product, as they are the same ones we see included with their other mice, and they are less than ideal for wired use, but since every gwolves mouse is designed to be used wirelessly, I usually give them a pass. However, here on the VUK, these cables still have the same issues, but due to the rearly positioned USB-C port, the mouse's wired usage, as mentioned earlier, is pretty bad, as the mouse gets unbalanced by cables when they're plugged into it. But again, the VUK is designed to be a wireless mouse, and it's capped to 1 GHz on its wired connection, so the only time you'll use these cables is for charging. So while these cables are not the best by any means, they're passable, but again, I recommend against using the mouse while it's charging given the aforementioned issues. Alright, well in closing, overall the gwolves VUK is without a doubt the most experimental mouse I've tried as of late, but I do have to say I love the concept of the super forward sensor, as it genuinely allows the VUK to have the most unique aiming experience I've ever felt on a mouse to date. On top of that, the mouse's great accessories included grips, solid build quality in QC, a great traditional symmetrical shape which is very well implemented, and its larger size gives the VUK fantastic hand size and grip style compatibility. The new Wano SBT switches are an amazing upgrade, and I really hope we see them return on gwolves' future mice and on other brands' mice for that matter, and the mouse's battery life is good, but it could be improved. But the mouse isn't perfect by any means, as my unit defaulted to the central sensor under some odd circumstances. Due to the lack of coding, you'll be entirely reliant on grip aids to use the mouse. The mouse is way heavier than advertised, weighing almost 5 grams heavier than advertised in some cases. The mouse also oddly lacks side button grip tapes, which makes their usage less than ideal, but you can cut your own of the extra grip pieces. The gapping on the side buttons is also quite small, which makes misactuating the opposite button common if you have larger hands like myself, and the side button's positioning and actuation weights could be improved as well. The mouse's scroll wheel is also very shallow, still usable, but its lower height does negatively impact its usage. The mouse's wired usage experience is very poor due to the rearly positioned USB-C port and the stock cables, and while the stock skates are improved from the ones included with gwolves' previous releases, they still have adhesive bleeding issues which can interfere with the top sensor in some cases, and as such I'd highly recommend using aftermarket skates here on the VUK, as aftermarket skates use higher quality adhesive that won't bleed and won't impact the mouse's sensors. But despite the quote-unquote cons here, I still think the VUK is a fantastic mouse and what I would highly recommend trying solely due to its forward sensor, as it gives an aiming experience you won't find on any other mouse on the market, and I truly hope gwolves continues to refine the VUK on future iterations, as with a couple tweaks and some changes, I genuinely think the VUK could be one of the best mice on the market. But we'll have to wait and see what gwolves has planned for the VUK's lineup, and I'll be sure to cover any future iterations of the VUK here on the channel, so get subscribed so you don't miss those videos, the VUK's teardown guide, and reviews of gwolves' other releases. But with that, that is everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much to everyone for watching. If you would like to support my efforts here on the channel with these in-depth reviews and the teardown project, consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support my efforts here on the channel, and being a member gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you want to support what I do here and see new episodes of the mel0n Review and teardown before anyone else, become a channel member today. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching my review of the gwolves VUK, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.